De-dollarization and BRICS, and why it's not actually happening. That's going to be the topic of this video. I know de-dollarization and BRICS are hot topics within the crypto community, but it's pretty much confined within the crypto community. No one actually else thinks it's going to happen. Not the businessmen of those foreign countries. Yes, the leaders like to posture a lot, but they're leaders. They have political reasons for actually doing that. But if you look at the businessmen of certain countries, you look at the demand of US bonds in times of crisis, that will show you who's still the boss. But there's like more problems with BRICS and this de-dollarization narrative than meets the eye, because I think it's a strong narrative within crypto, because a lot of people are subtly hoping that the dollar falls from grace and then somehow their crypto or Bitcoin picks up the slack. I hate to tell you this, but that's not happening. If you look at the US dollar right now, it accounts for about 90% of Forex trades and 60% of world reserves. Now, that's slightly down from about 65 to 70% from 20, 30 years ago. So it took 20, 30 years just to take it down that much. And the rise is not because of the Chinese yuan or anything. It's a little bit because of the euro, but it's also because like certain smaller countries have kept a little bit more of their own money reserves to try to stabilize themselves. And that's a big important point, and that should actually be the case. But the demand for the US dollar is not falling. Remember, if the US dollar's dominance was actually falling, other countries wouldn't actually complain that much if we raised the interest rates, because it shouldn't actually affect them all that much. But China bitched and whined a lot during COVID when we were jacking up those interest rates, because it makes their yuan less competitive against the dollar. And there's nothing they can actually do about it. See, the problem is there's actually no replacement for the US dollar. Crypto and Bitcoin is too volatile. For a reserve currency, it needs to not be volatile, and prices need to be able to be priced against it on a more stable basis. You can't have coins that drop like 5-10% daily. Yes, inflation is bad for the US dollar, but we're talking about it on a yearly basis, maybe like 5-8% at the highest. Like, it's not going to drop 50% overnight like some of these cryptos. Even Bitcoin can swing 50% or more within 6 months, which is the definition of hyperinflation. Note, like when FTX fell, when Terra Luna fell, that dropped like crazy within a few days. And you can't really, you really can't peg yourself to a coin or a currency that actually does that. So it's like Bitcoin and none of these other cryptos, they're not really going to replace the dollar. I've said this multiple times. I think they will be a parallel system to the dollar. I think they will actually be a parallel economy with its own ecosystem, notably DeFi and all that stuff, but it won't actually replace the dollar. I still think people are going to use fiat money for everyday use. I think crypto is mainly going to be an investment vehicle for the West, and maybe some currency use for poorer countries that can't get their hands on the US dollar. I really think that's more of crypto's purpose, and that could also already be a pretty big market. That could be $100 trillion market, just like the stock market, possibly bigger. So it's not like I'm chopping at crypto's potential, because crypto's potential, just based on that, is massively huge. It's just not going to replace the dollar. It's too volatile. What about other things? What else can replace the dollar? The Chinese yuan. I've explained this about 100 times. The Chinese yuan actually had a lot of trouble when the US raised interest rates. If it had any real chance of replacing the dollar, it wouldn't actually run into that problem. It actually depends on the dollar itself. China, unbeknownst to many of you, actually prints more money than the United States. It's just that they don't really tell us how much they print, because the government keeps a tight-lipped control over the dollar. It's not able to be traded on the international market. Therefore, it has very, very little liquidity. The thing is, like, China's using its political and economic power to try to make other countries hold Chinese yuan, especially some of those countries that do want to see a decline in the dominance of USD. But even those countries don't really want to hold that much Chinese yuan because of the lack of liquidity, and because you can't really buy anything else besides from China with Chinese yuan, because no other country basically staples, markets their goods or price their goods with respect to the Chinese yuan. They all do that to the US dollar because it is more stable, and the US dollar is a lot more transparent than the Chinese yuan. Yes, we print a crap ton of money, but at least we tell you how much we're printing. China prints a crap ton of money, but you don't get to know how much they're printing. And the thing is, like, you can't trade their currency for any other currency. A lot of businessmen in China are really wanting to trade the Chinese yuan for the US dollar, but they can't. The Chinese government has actually mandated that at maximum, an entity can only trade 50,000 US dollars worth of Chinese yuan per year out of China. But here's the thing. The banks are basically have a mandate to come up with every single excuse possible not to even allow you to do that. So to trade any large amount of money out of Chinese yuan to the US dollar, they essentially don't let you. So the Chinese yuan is actually being floated up by the government, not because people actually want the yuan, it's because they don't allow you to trade out of it. That kind of a system, once it really gets pressed, is bound to fall apart a lot more. So you don't really have a replacement for the US dollar. There is the euro, but the euro has the same problems as the dollar, and it's not quite as stable because the European Union, like the UK just left with Brexit, and there's a lot of like disunion within Europe, within the EU, because it is basically just an economic union. It's not really a political or military union, and it's not a country like the United States. So despite how many liaisons we have in the United States, Europe, the EU is actually a much looser union. So it can't really compete with the US dollar on a large scale. But don't make any mistake, the euro is by far the strongest competitor to the dollar. Now, some of you are talking about the BRICS currency. So let's actually take a look at BRICS. So BRICS basically is a 5-country alliance of developing nations right now. There are a lot of countries that want to join, but that might not actually help BRICS. Brazil, Russia, South Africa, China, and India. Those are the 5 countries. But the problem is even the core countries are not united. The BRICS currency is supposed to be backed by gold. India, I believe, has already pulled out of the BRICS currency. They haven't pulled out of BRICS, but they pulled out of the BRICS currency. India is the second largest economy in that group. And realistically, China and India is leaving the rest of the other BRICS in the dust, especially China right now with the world's second biggest economy. So those countries don't even have the same problems. They might be united in the want to actually lessen the US dominance, but that's not actually true. I think one of the reasons why India pulled out of BRICS is India doesn't actually want a bilateral world or a bipolar world where China and US are the 2 major powers. India would rather just have US have homogeny. Why? Yes, it has historical bitterness with the United States over the Kashmir region and Pakistan, but take a look at where that is right now. Like, which country threatens India more right now? China is much, much more threatening to India than the United States. And you can easily see why. For the last several decades, they've actually been having small military skirmishes with India around the border. They're fighting for border territory on disputed territory with India. And China exerts a lot of pressure on India, as with all the Southeast Asian countries. In fact, pretty much every country in that region hates China outside of Russia and maybe 1 or 2 other allies. Well, China, like Russia and North Korea. Pretty much all the other countries in that region, including the major powers, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. I'm not going to count Taiwan as part of China because to me it's really not. And India, they all don't like China. So the thing is, even within the 5 core members of BRICS, many of, 2 of them at least, are very antagonistic against each other. And they've had clashes, not only economically, but militarily, although in small spurts. And China and India, I think, will fight over other resources like water. So it is actually not within India's interest to promote this bilateral world where China is almost equal to the United States in power, because that would be very, very detrimental to India. China and India are competitors in the same geographic region for not only resources, but of course, territory and dominance. As much as there's bitterness in the past with the United States with India, right now, the US isn't the one that's actually vying with India for territory. The US isn't the one building BS islands in the South China Sea, taking like territory from countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, etc. That is China. So they're going to be, no matter what they say on the outside, they're always going to be more antagonistic towards China than the United States. And I think you're going to see that with India in the policies that they actually make. Even Russia's alliance with China is really not all that solid. It's really a temporary alliance out of convenience right now because, you know, they're both dictatorships and Western liberal democracies actually threaten them. And they also have a common interest in, like, China wants to take over Taiwan, much like how Russia wants to take over Ukraine. And that's why it's actually really important that we defend Ukraine, because if we're successful in defending Ukraine, China is much more or less likely to actually attack Taiwan because they'll see that the West is very, very committed to protecting, other democracies or other territories that aren't already China or Russia. And it's going to be very, very hard for them to win a war against Taiwan. If we kneel over and just let Russia take Ukraine, China will be emboldened to take Taiwan. And that is one of the reasons that the Ukrainian war is actually very important, just on a little diplomatic side note. But they're united by that because, like, China wants to swallow Taiwan and some other Southeast Asian territories, and Russia wants to swallow Ukraine. But after that, like, in the long run, China and Russia are actually not allies. There's historical tensions between the two countries. Remember, a lot of the northeastern part of China, Russia used to be China's, including its the biggest city over there. The northern part of China is also very, very short on water, especially the part around Beijing. They've actually talked about moving the capital because of lack of freshwater resources. Russia has a giant lake called Baikal in Siberia, and China is looking in that direction. There's very few people that actually live in Siberia, and China is actually getting people to actually move up there. So Chinese people will actually be the majority in a couple of decades. And then, there could be territorial tensions and wars that erupt. China can say, Russia's borrowing the excuse that, hey, a lot of these people in here are Russian. Therefore, we are basically just doing this war to essentially liberate our own people. China can make that same excuse. By the way, that is also the same excuse that Hitler made to invade Czechoslovakia back in World War II. So Russia is watching with nervous eyes. Vladimir Putin does not like what's developing, but Russia is becoming the junior partner in the China-Russia relationship, and he knows it, but he needs China's support right now for the Ukraine war, so he can't really do anything about it. But there is definitely a lot of tension between those two countries. And plus, if you look at BRICS, they're scattered all over the world. All these countries have different economic interests, different military interests, and different political interests. They don't really have that much in common with each other. And just like India, a lot of developing nations would actually benefit more from US homogeny, especially those in Southeast Asia, rather than having a bipolar order, especially if China is one of the two dominant countries that actually arises from the ashes of this two-world order. That would not benefit a lot of countries. Even countries like Brazil might not directly benefit from that. Latin America, after all, is a lot closer to the United States. So there's a lot of problems with BRICS because of internal tensions. As much as tensions as we have in the US, we are one country. And, we all kind of speak the same language and we all rely on the same economy. These other countries do not. They're very different. They're very, very disparate. And a lot of them just simply don't like each other. A lot of the developing world simply does not like each other. If you don't think China is actually going to have problems with Middle Eastern countries, just look at their treatment of the Uyghurs. I mean, right now, those countries aren't saying much because they need the economic benefits from China, but they're definitely watching with a leery eye. Like, the Muslim countries are definitely going to watch with a leery eye on how China treats the Uyghurs, and that's going to explode sometime in the future. China has a lot of people, and it's very, very hungry for resources. And its economy is also suffering right now because the birth rate is going backwards. I mean, the birth rate is less than the death rate, so they're actually losing people. And when you have that kind of issue that you can't solve with immigration like the United States can, you don't really have enough of a working class to support the older people after retirement. Japan has been in that conundrum for the last 30 years, and China is going to be in that conundrum very soon. And the problem is, China has zero way to solve that. And their conundrum is going to be way, way more serious than Japan's because of how the government is actually organized. The CCP is well aware of this, and they're actually afraid of this. They just won't really tell anyone. They just make up lies. But the international community and even Chinese people are not really believing those lies anymore. So the Chinese yuan right now isn't really an option to replace the US dollar because of the stuff I mentioned earlier, and because China's economy is going to run into a lot of trouble. That's one of the reasons Xi Jinping keeps on wanting to attack Taiwan. It is for the semiconductor chips and to break the first island chain, but getting that nationalistic rhetoric up there is basically one way to unite the people. That's the toxic nationalism. And it doesn't really matter what ethnicity you are. All like kind of demagogue leaders actually use it to try to rally people behind them. They like try to rally people against one enemy, whether it's like, wokeness or like, hey, Taiwan should be ours. It's kind of like the same principle. They just need like a central enemy for their people to rally around. As long as they can keep people distracted from everything else and focused on that one thing, they can actually remain in power. But that doesn't actually solve the root problem, especially in China with a decreasing population. And of course, the West is moving its production factories to other Southeast Asian countries. So China is trying to grab resources in Africa, but I don't actually think that will actually suffice and make up for the staggering or sputtering economy in the future. So, the thing is, like, de-dollarization is generally not going to happen because there's nothing to replace it. The BRICS dollar already had a major bailout with India. China, the yuan can't really replace it. The Japanese yen can't really replace it. The euro is not going to replace it, although it's the closest. So it'll be the dollar for the foreseeable future. Crypto is not going to replace it. It'll just be a parallel economy. So de-dollarization is going to happen. And BRICS is like way too fractured, and they don't really have a common goal between all these countries to really threaten the United States. So Uncle Sam is going to be number one for a very, very long time. You just watch. In 10 years, we'll be having this discussion again, and they'll still be repeating the same arguments, just like they were 10 years ago about how the US is falling, how de-dollarization is going to happen, and how it's going to be a bilateral world with China and US being the two major powers. I'll give you a hint. It's not going to happen, but in 10 years again, they'll be saying the same thing. Thank you, and have a nice day.